Okay, folks, can we have you come in, settle in? We've got to start because some people are desperately jet lagged from other parts of the world and others need to get onto jet planes. So, can we have people coming in? Please do come in towards the front because there will be other people coming in. This is an open session, it will be live streamed. So, people will come in and sit at the back. So, if you sit at the back, you're going to make movement rather messy and complicated. Yeah. So, while you're settling in, I mean, just a quick introduction to the people on this panel and what we're trying to do here. Um, so we have from my left Professor Karen Levy, who many of you have met over the day. Karen is at DPU. She was the former director of the DPU, also vice dean at UCL for many years, and we worked together for an awful long time. Her work is, of course, significantly on planning, but I think most critically, and we'll ask her to focus on that today, on questions of gender and intersectionality. Because we open the session very consciously, looking at equality, looking at, in a sense, the most fundamental, as far as I'm concerned, form of asymmetry or exclusion or potentially inclusion that we see in our cities. And we'd like to sort of close with that. And I'm going to ask Karen to close. Towards my right is Ratin Roy. Ratin is one of India's leading public economists, a public, political economy person who's worked for on a whole range of questions, of course, within India, but also outside. He's worked for the UN across, I don't know, I lost count, maybe 70, 80 countries by now. So he has extensive experience in pretty much most of the regions that we see represented in this room. In Latin America, he was in Brazil for many years, the director of the IGC Center there. In Asia, where he led the UN program across much of Asia. And within India, extensive experience with the Finance Commission earlier, and now as the director of National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, which is, in a sense, the leading think tank of the government of India on finance. But he does have very clear and independent opinions, different from that of a whole range of other people, both in government and outside. I've asked him to try and connect up some of the dots that we're seeing across the world on questions of, inequality by and large, because he's worked extensively on that question, specifically on urban inequality, and focus on some of the critical challenges the subcontinent, in particular India, is facing at this critical point of time. We are at a I would say at a turning point, at a critical juncture, both economically and in our politics. And finally, we have Colin McFarlane from University of Durham, Department of Geography, a critical geographer. Again, you've sort of seen and heard him, and many of you know his work. He's also worked extensively on South Asia and in India in particular. So we hope that he takes us into. Ratin and I were talking about a number of critical questions which we don't actually have good answers for. Maybe he does have some reflections on, on the politics of the city. Yes, because that's an area in which we're still trying to frame questions, and of course, much more critically trying to look at answers. So yeah, that's a panel that we have. We may, it's going to be a little complex because Ratin may have to leave in between; he has to catch a flight. But we'll try and open up a conversation and then keep it going. I know it's been a long day for many people, but we'll try and make it critical and interesting. So just a little bit of a context. I think a lot of the day has been involved in a range of different themes and a lot of grittiness in the engagement across a set of themes. I'm going to invite us at the panel to try and take this out, to step out a little bit, and also try and address some fairly fundamental questions that we're facing across the world on the relationship between urbanization and inequality, or if you look at it as a proposition of the questions of equality. And there's a lot of writing on this. A lot of us have read Harvey and a whole range of other people. But I think that the question is when the rubber hits the road in the protests in, let's say, Santiago, which have now led to the beginning of a new constitutional settlement there, the ongoing processes that are happening in Hong Kong, a whole generation of things that we've seen in Istanbul, in Cairo, and many other places of the world. What is actually happening? And in a sense, there is an explanation for this. Some of it structural, some of it otherwise, which is that a lot of this is because of at least 20 or 30 years of particular forms of development, which have enhanced inequality in significant ways. So that's one of the critical explanations. I guess one question that we struggle with here is that a lazy way of explaining things? Like informality. Informality is a very interesting thing, but it's not very useful in some sense. It's a great category, but you need to break it down, and in very particular contexts, it means a whole range of different things. So, is inequality, or the way that we define inequality in particular contexts, is it something that we have to really understand much more clearly, or is it completely driven by a discourse which is focused on economic inequality? And that's important in the Indian context, because when we talk about questions of caste and gender, which are absolutely central to our situation at the moment, wealth and the intergenerational transmission of wealth, whether it's in terms of property, which is a ongoing battle as far as women are concerned in this country, or questions that we deal with caste, which are critically related not only to income but also to wealth and how that's transmitted. So that's the other set of questions that are there. Are there other dimensions than the somewhat narrow and even the broader dimensions that we pick up as we look at different multiple dimensions of poverty? The third thing that I think may be interesting and critical to look at is, in some senses, the standard model of development. Because many parts of the world, including South Asia, do not follow it. When I talk about the standard model of development, we're talking about urbanization as a process, which in a Rostovian manner, in some senses, you move from a certain form of development, you move from an agrarian economy, and we're going through that transition at the moment, to one that's more industrial, like China has done, to one that's dominated by the service sector. In actual fact, at least in South Asia, that's not the way things happen. India's 1/3 urban, 2/3 rural by definition, but in terms of the way of working and the way of functioning, and the way that informality and inequality reproduces itself, it might be quite different. So does that frame actually work? Because we use that in a whole range of tropes and imaginations, both political and otherwise, etc. So the reason I'm saying that is the embeddedness of inequality. And those of us, there's been a strong discourse around what Kuznets sort of defined, that there's a certain way of dealing with that. The connection between that and urbanization is something that I think we need to unbundle, and we have a lot of really heterodox examples in the room, ranging from Tanzania at one end, or Cuba at the other end, or other countries in Africa, where this is in a sense a central question. And this is not only a question for Asia, but in a sense what's happening in Asia today is a precursor to the kind of challenges that we're going to see, or the opportunities in many parts of Africa. Because over the next 15 or 20 years, you're going to see what potentially has happened in China, happening in this part of the world, at least in terms of numbers of people. How is it going to play itself out? And this connects with obviously questions of employment and access to work, and doing that in a changing global environment where the nature of work itself is changing, in which the intersection of informality and of work and place are coming together in many places, but also in sometimes in very large urban systems. And when I mean large urban systems, I don't mean large megacities or mega urban regions, which is what the Chinese example is moving towards, but also regions which have 40, 50, maybe 100 million people. And you can see that happening in Ethiopia, you can see that happening in Nigeria, you can absolutely see that happening in many parts of South Asia, whether it's Dhaka or Karachi, or many cities that we work on in the country. So how does the standard model work, and where does inequality sit within that, both in terms of the theory and the politics in some senses? So the challenge in India that we have is that our political imagination is such that our delimitation of political constituencies is still sitting in an earlier era, because we're unwilling and unable to bring it up to speed. So our parliamentary constituencies, our local constituencies are still based on a 1991 census frame, while the level of urbanization is shifting. So the question, I guess, there is, Does inequality have a role inside this? Is institutionalized inequality something that drives a particular form of politics? Is that something that's driving what's actually happening at the current point of time? And I guess two or three other dimensions that are tied to that. So there's a strong focus often on income and employment and the economic dimensions. But as far as this region of the world is concerned, I would say the most important questions are questions of social justice, are questions of the embedded asymmetries that have existed and are very stable and unchanging in some senses, not for decades and centuries, but actually for millennia. The questions of caste, of gender, great debates at the moment about faith and religion, ethnicity. Because for better or for worse, in 5 years' time, this country is going to be the largest population in the world. We're going to surpass China in terms of population size. We're going to touch 1.5 billion people. But 1.5 billion people with the largest population of poor people the world actually has. And that's just one dimension of inequality. Vulnerability is another dimension to that. So within that, what is the role or what are the potentials of dealing with of the equal city as far as social justice is concerned? And the reason I'm saying that is very simple. If you look at the history of the city for the last 5,000 years, cities have concentrated, allometrically or otherwise, opportunities for employment, for job creation, for a better life, access to culture, a whole range of other things. But we do not talk about the dark side of urbanization. And this is true pretty much across the world. So cities also concentrate risk. We heard about that very clearly today. They concentrate poverty. We know that as a fact. In India, there's a deeper concentration of poverty in urban areas than otherwise. The Latin American experience speaks to this very clearly. So also some parts of Africa. But it also systematically concentrates inequality. And in fact, I mean, there is both theory and otherwise an understanding that it is the inequality that we concentrate in cities that provides us the dynamic engine that enables a whole range of possibilities for some people and the lack of others to take place. So, I guess one of the instrumental questions is this a useful thing to do? Does it work? How far does it take before this actually blows up? And in a sense, a direct question to Rathin, as we look at constitutional settlements over the last 150 years or even longer than that, the pivots of those constitutional settlements have been, with some slight exception with the Chinese example, in urban areas. I mean, we have to think about that. So cities are the places where these forces concentrate. Some of the greatest social innovations have actually started in urban areas. You wouldn't have had, the end of slavery if it were not for mobilization in cities and in parts of, in parts of the West. Similarly, a lot of the other social and other battles have been fought in various places. So whether it's St. Petersburg about 100 years ago, whether it's a whole range of other processes, or even what happened in Rwanda in some senses, the concentration of inequality, violence, and the opportunity to be able to restructure political settlements in some senses has become quite strong. And even in China, where the transition took place around a very different politics and process, the cultural revolution, in a sense, is something that we do not talk about. And having spent some time and some engagement in that process, that is something that was absolutely critically situated and built out from the urban fabric. So how does one try and think about these questions? And as we look at a world in which we have these fancy things which are called the SDGs, which are sort of politically aligned goals, and we've talked about them a little bit in the morning and the evening. If you look at 5 and 10, how do they sit within this very dramatically changing fabric where we have a world in which there are going to be 5 billion people in cities, where both, let's say, the positive side, the opportunities, and the deep challenges of inequality are actually going to sit together? Do we have enough theory to think about it? How can we start framing these questions? And what are the ways forward? Because, at least as far as IHS is concerned, criticality is not enough. What are the propositions in place? And the propositions will come from multiple points of the compass in some senses. And how does one take that proposition effectively in some senses into action or into agency? Because the question of inequality is fundamentally about constraining agency. Some people either constraining it because they're forced to from the outside, some people being constrained because it's reproduced from generation to generation. And how do those shifts take place? So I thought I'd be a little provocative and try and sort of move this out of of bit of a, of where it was. And Ratin, if you want to start.
Is this working? Can you all hear me? Okay. Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to IHS. I'm a macroeconomist, I must confess. So it's very difficult for me to understand even aggregations like urban and non-urban. But I think because, as Aru said, well, my years in the UN and my years in India especially have taught me something, that the economics is very simple. There's nothing particularly complicated about running an economy. The problem is okay, now you're getting a good example of why India is a high cost country to do business. No. I normally have a loud voice, so that's not possible. It's a technology. Only happens here. The problem is the sociology always screws up the economy. And it's such a pity. Because if only it didn't, then we wouldn't get the sort of brickbats we get when things don't quite go as they plan. So, I want to talk about 3 economic propositions globally, which have an underpinning sociological construct to them globally. And I want to say to you rather provocatively that I think the SDGs are the last attempt made to divorce these questions from their sociological and power underpinnings and pretend that they are technologically solvable. When I worked in the UN, I used to call happy event management. Okay? Ways to do things. That is, the League of Extraordinary, largely gentlemen, now a few more women, will sit together in New York, only a few mind, and sort of the IMF and the World Bank and the IMF and the World Bank will work out the macro, and is this working? The IMF and the World Bank, for the 3rd time, will work out the macro, and the UN will sort of work on happy, ILO will work on labor. That sociology that the SDGs ignore, and they have to, okay, I've worked for the UN for many years, it's a multilateral organization, you have to be happy, except in the Security Council. As far as the social and economic development agenda is concerned, it has to be we can all get together and help each other, we have a common planet place. But underneath that, there are some realities which have not changed. Let me start with one. Macroeconomic reality, super macro. The total annual increment to the stock of savings in the world is $5.5 trillion. The stock, increment to the stock, delta. You want money for the SDGs or whatever you want to do, you want to, buy little rubber ducks for all the children in the world after there's plenty of money. There's no shortage of money. So it is how money is allocated across the globe that creates a financial constraint for the SDGs in the first place. And underneath that allocation lies a profound understanding of a balance of power, which has been as follows. When the countries that are now rich were relatively young, then income was how those countries got rich. In macro, we put it very politely. We call R the rate of return on capital, read Piketty, and we call G the rate of return on growth. And when an economy is getting rich, for which it needs young people, G is the income that everybody earns, and R is the income that people with accumulated money earn, right? So if your G is greater than your R, it means your younger people are contributing to your prosperity. And then comes a point when you start getting old, and R becomes greater than G. And that is what fuels inequality. If you read Piketty, that's the fundamental proposition he has in advanced economies. I have 2 things to say on that to illustrate the power equation, and this affects the SDGs, but you won't get anyone talking about it. When R becomes greater than G, that is the rate of return on capital becomes greater than the rate of growth. How many times are we going to do this? Okay. Then you have a problem, which is the problem of this century. I predict at least the first 2 decades. And the problem is twofold. One, all the nice places to invest are not where old people are, which is why places where old people live, like Japan and Sweden, are full of 2% interest wallahs, 3% interest wallahs. You'll be lucky if your portfolio made 4%. Come to my country with the exchange rate risk. I used to say till last year. You can still say that about Malaysia and Bangladesh. I'll make you 11. I'll make you 10. So logically, that $5 trillion should be flowing here because neoclassical economics, complete capitalism, don't have to go further. Why is it not coming here? Because now the game in those advanced countries is to keep R greater than G, and this is affecting everything, including climate change. I'll tell you how. Nobody talks about the balance of power when they talk about climate change, and it really pisses me off because climate change is all about the balance of power. It is one of the ways in which you can get young people in the developing countries to pay for the pensions of old people in the developed country. I'll tell you how. Who makes solar panels? Doesn't matter. And please keep China out of this for a second. Who innovates, pioneers solar panels? And you can bring in China later. Okay, I'll say this by example to you actually. It's even better. So, SoftBank gave us a lot of money. I can't remember, $100 billion, $200 billion. And I saw that loan. And it was given at ridiculous rates of interest, like 0.5% over 30 years. I said, this is practically free money, man. Please take it. Then 2 years down the line, when they had started doing whatever they were doing with renewables, I asked for the income streams from the projects. And I found to my shock that 17% of the, between 13 and 17% of the revenue streams of these projects were hypothecated as a first charge, which is before you pay your workers, before you pay your capitalists, the first thing you pay for intellectual property rights for those panels. And the only condition Japan had then was please buy our panels and nobody else's. Since we can't buy Chinese panels because of energy security, we said, cool, we'll buy Japanese panels. Doesn't matter the expensive, they're giving us free money. So this was a very nice way for Japan to get me in perpetuity year after year through the IPs to pay for their old people. I've got this game. And I've got this game because when we talk about our common planet, and I've had this about a controversial position on this, which is I'd like to see the West reduce central heating and put on some blankets, and then I think, we can have a budgetary reorientation. Nobody talks about what should be a public good in the first place, which is intellectual property. Why is nobody arguing? People talk about adaptation, mitigation, blah, 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 blah. What about intellectual property? Why should that not be the focus of any UN or World Bank or Paris discussion? That should be a free good. It should be available to everybody as a free good. I estimate that would cost us about $300 to $400 billion over 5 years. It's peanuts. Won't be done because the same old game is involved. So I think what we are seeing in terms of global inequality is this phenomenon. The second phenomenon we are seeing very quickly as a consequence of globalization and the globalization of elites, and this is relevant to urban spaces, is that it is now possible for elites, at least let me put it this way, when you attain a certain level of development, then your elites play in metropolitan areas and live in rural areas because your public services allow you to do so. All my years in England, that's what I noticed. All the rich people I knew had houses in Hampshire. But they played with me in London, but they went back to Hampshire. In the South Africas and in Brazil especially, I know well, rich people play and live in urban areas. And they go to tour rural areas, it's exotic. In countries in India, and dare I say, I never like using the word Africa, please, I will never use it. And dare I say, specifically in some countries in Africa where I have worked, like Kenya, the rich tend to live in urban areas, and it is the aspiration of those who live in rural areas to grow rich to also come and live in urban areas, and that affects the urban settlement. I got this so nicely, not in Kenya, in Ethiopia once. Many years ago I was teaching, and I was trying to teach something to do with the value of property, something very ordinary. I was an academic then. And I said, okay, so in Addis Ababa, would a house on this road have a greater value than a house inside? It came up, and they said, of course, the house on the road. They said, why? This is because inside the public services are crap. I don't get power, I don't get this. And I was thinking, oh, but a house on the road is noisy, and it shouldn't be, So I think in terms of urbanization, we have to distinguish between why or what motivates the rich to engage in urbanization. I've seen very little, at least in India, literature on that subject. Everyone talks about the urban poor in India. I'm actually really interested in the urban rich. I need to understand how people in Malabar Hill engage with the city. I have no idea there's a horrible place called Gachibowli in Hyderabad where rich people live, Banjara Hills. I don't know Bangalore where rich people live. Why any rich person would live in Bangalore is beyond me with with the urban infrastructure you have. But those people, how do they engage with the city? What do they do? To an extent, there is a cultural transition that needs to be made, which is an elite transition, which came to me once when I worked in Sierra Leone. So I was there and we were having this conference on development, blah, blah, blah. Chandrika, when we worked together when I was in the UN. And, I said, the problem is, boss, that it takes me longer to get from Lungi Airport to the city of Sierra Leone than it takes me to fly from London to Lungi Airport. And that's not a trivial distance. Because you take a boat with Gaddafi's picture on it in those days. I hope they built a bridge now. Or you took a UN helicopter which had drunk Russians and never did. So, and then I told them, I said, boss, you see, the problem is that its problem is not the poor or anything. I said, your elites are the problem because your aspirations are very low. You have BMWs, but you drive them on potholed roads. Your children get dengue and malaria. My country, too, to an extent, is improving. Elites of Kuala Lumpur, I said, should aspire to live like the elites of Freetown should aspire to live like the elites of Kuala Lumpur. And now in my own country, I see that the elites of Mirzapur should want to live like Delhi. Delhi is a nice city, yeah? Pretty livable if you ignore the pollution. I mean, the traffic is okay, there are malls, whatever you want. So, English movies, embassies, so French movies. So, assuming the elites of Mirzapur want all that, they should be aspiring to make Mirzapur like Delhi. But their contentment level with driving, big cars on crappy roads and having bad water supply and trying to privatize leads to a thoroughly unsatisfactory and low productive life. And I have not unpacked this. I really need to understand why this is happening. Where there is no instinct of self-preservation. So that's global. Is there anybody here, you said subcontinent, from Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, not the Maldives, Bhutan? Then I'll confine myself to India. So I think in India, what I want to say is very depressing. That if you look at the history of growth in India, our binding constraint to growth is our sociology. And I will explain that with one analogy, but let me tell you why I'm saying that. I'm saying that because I don't have time here to justify it, but you can Google me. The growth that India has seen since 1991 has come on the back of the consumption of the top 150 million people of this country. First it was 50, then it was 100, then it was 150, then it stopped. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because if you go to Bombay, my fellow suits, leading indicators of the Indian economy, okay? What do people who earn the minimum wage, forget the poor, they don't count for this purpose. Okay, that's about half of India, but let's leave them alone, we'll subsidize them. But what do people earning the minimum wage or twice the minimum wage consume in this country? As I do. We try to consume a decent meal. We try to buy some clothes. We try to build one house in our lifetime. We try and consume reasonable healthcare, reasonable education. So food, clothing, housing, health, education, none of these are part of the leading indicators of the Indian economy as measured by Bombay. What are part of the leading indicators of the Indian economy as measured by Bombay, and it's not because you can't get high frequency data, you get very high frequency data if you want to invest in it, are automobiles, fast moving consumer goods, air travel for God's sake. But that is logical, because what you're trying to track is how the top 150 million in the economy are behaving. So they will be your leading indicators. But there's a political sociology to this, which comes, I call India the museum of inequality. If you ever want to set up a global museum of inequality, come to my country. Please set it up somewhere. We have economic inequality, we have social inequality, we have absolutely staggering levels of gender inequality. I mean, patriarchy is a too mild a word to describe it. I don't know how to describe clan and kin patriarchy through Kap Panchayats. It's bizarre. The collective patriarchy. We have, I let people tell me. Somebody please ask me a question and say, does this inequality exist in India? And I'll really learn from you if I have to say I'm not sure even, or not give you an example. So you talk about multi-dimensional inequalities here in India. And that affects, in a multiplicity of ways, both how high cost your economy is, and I'll give you one example of that, and why you are not able to become China. How high cost? When we employ women in the workplace, there is a requirement, at least in North India, that we have to provide safe and secure transport for these women to go to a certain place. A consequence of that, research shows, is either women, so here I can finger less pay for equal work. They are getting less pay for equal work according to employers because they are spending more on their quote unquote welfare. Okay. Now, what can be more highly unproductive than this? Other than the government of India, which has a very generous childcare leave policy, which is not generous actually, it's eminently sensible. Okay, where across your lifetime in the public service, you can take up to 2 years of childcare leave, excluding your maternity leave. So that is used, and I can just certify this where I have worked. I have not seen, out of a sample of let's say 100, I have seen only 5 people misuse it. That's really low. If you compare it to men who misuse leave by 21-30%, talk about sick leave. They take it at critical moments when children's exams happen, etc., etc., etc. But when it comes to maternity or childcare leave, these things are taken into the cost of running a business without taking account of the consequences of doing this, which is that you you exclude people who are potentially getting skilled. And forget the ethics of it. Yeah? From the labor force at critical movements, and then they have to either reskill or drop out. And recent research is showing that the decline in the labor force participation rate in urban areas is happening because of these self-imposed, in Hindi I have to say this, Sheikh Chilli, apna dal kato, which is cutting off your nose to spite your face in a sense, self-imposed absurd restrictions on encouraging the employment of women. It's bizarre. Then I could go on. I could tell you how the top college in Delhi violates human rights every day by locking up, and this has been happening since my wife went to that college. It's still happening to my shock. By locking up women inside their hall of residence all night. They are locked up. They cannot, not just they can't leave, they're locked up. Okay, penitentiary. For the privilege of being educated in that college, they have to accept that rule. Their parents have to sign, otherwise they're not allowed. So you have these micro dimensions, I would call them, of gender inequality. Actually, I don't have time, but you can take these up to macro. And then you have a problem that, which is much like, in communist parties, I always found that, we have a communist hangover here called the Department of Women and Children. WCD it is. I never understood why. They do vaccination. They do very important stuff. But why it is called the Department of Women and Children, I never understood. What's that got to do with vaccinations? Or midday meal schemes? But this structure that has developed is in complete elision with institutions like Khap Panchayats, institutions like Zilla Parishads, where women are elected by law to an office, and then men are required to come in and substitute for them. And I think the one space where this particular issue is being interrogated is urban. And the one space where it can be interrogated and can be a liberating force is urban. But no political party, and for that matter, no social movement, argues that we should actually give priority to the migration of women, women students, women workers, to urban spaces where they're better able to function elsewhere to solve the falling labor force participation problem. My second example, do I have 5 minutes?
Yeah.
My second example comes from those 5 indicators I give you. So I'm pissed off about these 5 indicators. And before I had more things to get pissed off about recently, I used to work on these. Now there are more important things to work on. The textiles. I looked at the data. So this is a Marks and Spencer shirt, yeah, made in India. It costs about $70. Exactly the same price as Oxford Street or New York. 95% made in India. So my shirt is made in India. Cool. But if you go out there and try and buy 400 rupee shirts, which is not, poor people can't afford shirts. Huh? Poor people have cloth, tone. Minimum wage people can afford 400 rupee shirts. Minimum wage, 2x the minimum wage. 62% of them are made in, not China, Vietnam and Bangladesh. Vietnam and Bangladesh. So I'm like, what the hell is going on here? So I go and do some research last year. I go to 2 places where they make these shirts. Tirupur in South India, nice guys. And South Gujarat, not so nice guys. Anyway, so I met them. And I said, hey man, there's a big market there. Why aren't you doing it? They said, oh, there's no profit. I said, no, it's a volume business. You want to talk to me? I'm an economist. I'll show you volume profit. I'll do the math for you. Because obviously Bangladeshis are making profit selling here. I want that profit here. And I had a bigger, I'm a nationalist. I said, if I can produce those 400 rupee shirts in India, I'll knock Bangladesh and Vietnam out of the textiles market forever. Boss, I'll export to everybody. Everybody. Right? So that's my nationalist side. But then what do I get? No, there's no profit. I said, but why? Wages are too high. I said, what, in India? Wages are too high? So what wages? Wages of Tirupur and South Gujarat, which are 4x the per capita income of India. So I said, no, I didn't mean you set them up here. You can make this shirt here, I understand. You got to set them up in UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, where poor people live and where the market is. They're like, oh, yeah, but you know what? They are very unskilled people. I said, don't talk nonsense. 25% of your workforce is from UP, Bihar, Jharkhand. They're all emigrating here. I can see them in your factory. They're working there. Why can't they be entrepreneurs? Then came the real reason. They said, and I'll say this in Hindi, how many people here understand Hindi? Most of the Indians do. And I'll translate. Because it's more poignant for us as Indians. उनका स्वभाव ही कुछ खराब है. उन लोगों की नीयत खराब है, उनका दिमाग ठीक नहीं है. तो मैंने पूछा, जस्ट ट्रांसलेट, तो आप फिर उनको यहाँ के काम करने देते हैं? यहाँ तो हम उनको कंट्रोल कर सकते हैं. उनका नीयत एकदम ठीक, 18 घंटे काम करते, डॉर्मेट्री जाते हैं, सुबह आते हैं, बीवी बच्चे नहीं ले आते, वो साल में एक बार ट्रेन का भाड़ा देता हूँ, वो ठीक है, आप जानते नहीं हो ये, नहीं तो दंगा फसाद हो जाता है शहर में. दिस इज तिरुपुर.
Translate, please.
Yes. So they said, I'm trying to find the right word for it. There is something wrong with the nature of the human beings who live in northern and eastern India. There is something wrong with their minds. There is something wrong with their intentions. So I said, but they are working on your shop floor here, man, all these evil people. And they said, oh, that's okay, because here we control them. They work 18 hours a day. They go to the dormitory. We don't let them bring their wives and kids here. We've seen what happens when they do that. Then they open shops. Then they take over our business. That's why they are bad. Now you tell me, what am I going to tell a bunch of economists when I say this? They look very disappointed. They say, no, come on. It's a wage rate problem. I said, yeah, but the foundational problem is not even the reason why they are not going to low wage areas, because they think those guys are bad people. So that is what I've got to tackle. So I think we are, the difference, I think, between many emerging economies and the South Africas and the Brazils and the Philippines and the Thailands of the world, and this is, I think, very important for many emerging economies in Africa and in the Middle East, is that they have not been able to arrange or manage to arrange a political settlement that is able to address these deep-rooted sociological problems. And why I said I think more important things to do is I think my country is going the same way. 2 years ago, I warned about this recession. I was told off by economists, and I said that, the history of development, and I'm going to finish in 2 minutes, is littered with stories of failure. It's a very depressing movie, the development movie. There are only 2 good guys in that movie. They're called South Korea, maybe Taiwan. Please don't talk about Singapore. And yeah, there's China, but China is special. Okay. But if you look around the world, it is littered with cases who failed. Where do I start? In my own continent? The Philippines, Thailand, all of the Middle East. Okay, they were resource cursed. Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, right? Turkey. These are terrible places. They aspired to become developed countries and things fell apart at one point. And what did you get? You got huge youth dissatisfaction. You got rising crime. You got an elite that huddled in enclaves, right? And they were not able to resolve the sociology because by then it was too late. And my big worry and my guilt, because a lot of younger people here, is we are bequeathing you a legacy where this country, where I've had I didn't live here, unfortunately. I should have when the times were good. 26 years of economic transformation. That party is over. It is over for the reasons of the middle income trap. It is also over because the sociology of this country is now cracking. And people are actively seeking to evade the need for a sociological settlement by voting, may I remind you, by voting, consciously voting for political parties that explicitly their manifestos state that they have an agenda which the young in this country have now decided to protest against. But for that, you'll have to understand, and I'll conclude on that note, and this is just for the young people in this room, Indians. We are now a minority. There is very little difference now between a Muslim and an educated liberal in this country. Get used to it. the majority consensus that India is a secular country and an emancipatory space where we do have problems of caste, gender, etc. We have the Museum of Inequality, but our national task, in a sense, is to overcome it. And you do not overcome something by appealing to the least common denominator. You overcome something by providing an ideological narrative to the young that rises above the least common denominator. That is over. Now we have the politics of the least common denominator, and we have to fight it, and we have to protest it. In that fight, there are no politicians with you. All political forces in this country that do not support this agenda do not support any agenda that can be described as vaguely ideological. So this will come through protest and through organization first at a decentralized level, and then we must understand that it will be a long, long protest, but essentially what you're protesting is the defense of an idea of India, which is not capturable in words like secular, which is captured in the idea of emancipation and a recognition that I thought the Constitution has, that we are not a country that is emancipated from multiple inequalities. And the task for the last 50, 60 years was to try and emancipate ourselves. Possibly we were shortchanged, possibly we shortchanged. Why? I'm from that generation. Let me also take the blame. We shortchanged you. And the result has been this reversion to the least common denominator. But that is also, let me go back to my economics to conclude, a reversion to accepting that India will go the Philippines way and not the South Korea way. Thank you. I hope that was not too provocative.
So first, I mean, just, Rajan might have to leave really. He was provocative. I just thought that, if we can have Colin and Karen, if you have any quick responses, we can take them, and then maybe I'll open up the floor, and he might have to leave in the next 20, 25 minutes, and we can continue. Any responses based on what happened today? It was a little depressing towards the end, but it was,
Depressing country to live in now.
So, can I open it up to you?
I'm afraid I can't lift the tone.
That's fine.
But it seems to me that there are many political processes going on in many parts of the world where there are very similar kinds of things happening. And, sorry.
I'll give you this.
It's
Working? What's happened? Yeah. Yeah, it'll speak up and it'll come up.
better?
Yeah, a little bit closer. No, bring it closer.
No?
Yeah.
Okay. It seems to me that, as I said, I can't raise the tone to a more positive outlook, unfortunately, because it seems to me that there are many places in the world where, based on a really very destructive, negative politics, based often on racism, on various ethnic bases, and a range of things, including gender, of course, but also class that you've alluded to, that exists and is being manipulated and used by politicians across the globe. And in a way, it's a very big challenge for all of us, I think, to kind of put together an alternative vision, which I think it behoves all of us to be part of, an alternative vision and an alternative alliance to creating another kind of politics.
You've seen that happening in South Africa because you were part of the transition, or you saw the transition years. Are there any things that we can learn from that?
Well, this is the sort of question that I'm going to duck.
Good, Colin. Yeah, it's on.
Yeah, is this working? It's working.
Yeah.
I guess, I mean, a fascinating set of questions. I mean, I guess one of the issues I was thinking about was this example of the shirts that you were talking about. And I'm just wondering, occasionally there are these sporadic debates, for example, about countries across, say, Southeast Asia getting together and setting, say, minimum standards around pay, conditions around, say, textiles or manufacturing sectors, and operating as a kind of block and trying to influence some of the global architecture that you were quite sort of pessimistic about at the start. And I'm wondering where you see the potential for that happening, because after all, the global discourses, the global architecture does change. I mean, the fact that there is a very squarely urban agenda now at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals is a huge achievement and took generations of struggle. That, you know, Karen and Aroma know a lot more about the struggles and the fights to get there over the years. So can you see ways in which those kinds of, because surely in the longer run, the objective is not so much whether the shirts are made over the border in Bangladesh or not, but whether there are minimum standards and conditions of production either side of the border. And so that kind of scaled regional kind of voice, are those kind of possibilities, do you see those possibilities?
Yeah, yeah.
No. Okay, that's that. Yeah, I kind of figured you were going to say that.
Yeah.
I'd ask anyway.
So any reasons why you would want to say why you say no?
Well, it's quite obvious. Okay, let's start next door. Bangladesh is going through let me tell you another interesting political economy fact to explain this. Remember, when countries, poor countries like even mine, until very recently it was very pronounced, but certainly Bangladesh today, poor people export stuff and rich people import stuff. Always remember that, young people. Poor people export commodities, rich people import malt whiskey. Poor people export commodities, rich people send their kids abroad. Poor people export commodities, rich people. Bangladesh. I'm half Bengali, I worked there too, I just came back from Dhaka. Poor people set up textile factories, work in textile factories. Poor people export textiles, rich people in Bangladesh then set up Hiltons and Meridians if they don't stash away their money in London. Myanmar, basket case, sorry. Thailand, I've lived there, weird country, but suffice to say, the elites there have a stranglehold which does not involve equal pay for equal work unless someone makes a movie about Gap. Cambodia, dictator. Laos, dictator. Vietnam, too busy creating an elite and following China. Philippines, basket case. Indonesia, collapsing. There cannot be any political alliance in a situation when most of Asia is fragile internally. And notice, I'm not brought up China. I love doing this. I like to talk about everything and then say, on top of that, I have to worry about China. Mongolia, natural resource stout, right? Where will there is no it's not like Bandung or in the 1960s where for better or worse, you had a common pan-Asian or pan-developing country political ideology where this would make perfect sense because you're absolutely right in economic terms. That if we actually did that, then all that would happen is that Marks and Spencer shirts would cost $20 more, but we'll still be cheaper than anybody else. So we'd still sell shirts and our workers would earn more. But it's a prisoner's dilemma, if those of you know what that means. I mean, yeah, it's a prisoner's dilemma classically.
Okay. Can we open this up for discussions? Not, 3, 4, 5 questions. Any quick responses?
Pakistan is also in trouble. And Iran is in trouble. And Central Asia is in trouble. Sorry, very depressing one.
Yeah.
Don't want with Africa and say things are bad. I think they're pretty bad.
Yeah.
Go Afghanistan.
No, I'm happy to. Thanks to all. We are tired, yeah? If there are very few hands, it's only that we are tired. It has been a long day. I suppose I just wonder two things. On the one hand, just thinking about this reframing, Aro started by saying, okay, can we go a bit beyond the criticality and become more propositive? Now, if I think about economic reframings of inequality, I see economic reframings of inequality dominating the whole debate of inequality, both in the propositive and in the diagnostic. So somehow, following what you were saying, I thought we started by discussing that there was a problem, if you wish, in the distribution of value, which obviously has to do with inequality, and then we end in denouncing a problem in the creation of value. But this loop is typical of the economic inequality discussion that we keep on having dominating debates. So I just wonder if, for you, what is out of this? I mean, how do we get out of this loop where we start by discussing we have a problem with distribution, then let's rethink how do we create value in a different way because as you told us, there is value. There are resources, there is enough money to be redistributed. So there is something around that in the economic logic that seems to be putting us in a circular way. And I just want to hear from Karen and Colin about other framings that you think are emerging beyond economic inequality. What else is helping us to really move from that diagnostic to that more propositive framing of inequality?
Thanks, Jenna. Can we pick up a couple of other questions and then, and then we'll let them respond in one round. Yeah, sure. No, go. We'll take 4 questions, doesn't matter. Let's bring them together because, Kombe, yeah.
Right.
Please.
Thank you, Radhan. When you spoke about R, I thought actually what you were going to talk about, and that's what I want to ask you about, is where resources will come from for young people. So where are they going to earn? Are they going to earn wage incomes? Are they going to earn rental incomes? And one of the realities that we're seeing now is as work as we know it changes quite dramatically, people that own capital will earn disproportionately. We know that. It's already happening. It's going to accentuate unless there is a change in ownership patterns. So a social ownership of capital as a way to change how wealth is created and for whom wealth is created. Is that something that you're imagining is already happening? Is there conversation around it? Is there a way to think about it that would allow us to also then think of what young people might do in order to move both socially but also economically out of very preset and limited spaces where they are right now because of skilling? And we know that this entire generation that we're looking at is unskilled or poorly skilled. So they have opportunities from labor. What else is there?
Sorry, Bish. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it is really interesting and very provocative presentation. It's raised many issues because you went from the global relationship to city. The connections between global, national, local was not very clearly spelled out, but nevertheless, it's implicit in your presentation. So I have two questions to you, partly because you referred to the 1960s, and even Bandung goes back to 50s. In economic theory, generally speaking, political economic theory, when development field started, there was a basic assumption there's a relationship between political systems and economic performance. Right? Capitalist market economies needed Western-style democracy, and Western-style democracy needed capitalist economic development. That was the basic assumption. It kind of fell apart in the early 70s with Latin America. Again, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the issue came back. I want to ask your position on this relationship between economic systems and economic performance and political systems. That is very important.
Okay, that's really big questions. That's an entire Kombe. This is an entire course. Forget about being a seminar. Yeah.
In fact, my question has been preempted, but I want to add there that do you see a chance, a better opportunity if you compare the democracy, the level of democracy, the level of governance system which you have? Do you see any difference between countries with relatively better governance system and those which are terribly difficult to see? And therefore, the way he analyzes the political economy of that country being a determinant factor. And where do you see institutions, the lower-level institutions, where do you see them having a room for maneuver in terms of transforming such strong power interests?
Last question, Gautam.
I wanted to ask you on the last point you made about protest in response to, say, a sociological break. If you were to think about what the nature of protest should be, that is not just then taking on a kind of constitutional resolution, but that's backed by a kind of economic break as well. If you were to advise on what the nature of protest then should be, because if it's going to be a long sense of protest, the question also is what is the protest about? And if it is a macroeconomic diagnosis of a constitutional break and vice versa, how should our tactics of protest change in order to answer the right question?
Okay, good. Go for it.
Let me start with you, Madam. I'm privileged enough, although I'm just an economist, to be familiar with the regulation school. And your question comes, in my view, from there, I think, and I think it's a very important question. I would interpose something. I would interpose, and this is where I differ with Marxists, that in the business of creation of value or its disposition, there are social constructs which mediate and mediate. In the case of, I think, intersectionality in remarkably uniform ways across economic categories, and in the case of other things like caste or ethnicity, in diverse ways. But social scientists as a whole, when talking about public policy, have not managed to bring about a harmonious illusion between these two, except economists, because we simply assumed away society. Your average undergraduate, there's only one textbook I can think of that will speak of society amongst any of the elite schools where things are taught. Wendy Carlin's book does. And therefore it doesn't start with macro, micro, but that's only one book. So I, as an economist, had to go out and learn about sociology, and more importantly, the way economics has done this is by, and it was helped by globalization, is by proclaiming, globalization proclaimed what economics always did, that history doesn't matter. History basically can be divided into, t minus 1 and t plus 1 are the same thing. There's nothing, you can't populate t minus 1 and t plus 1 except, in any mathematical construct, doesn't matter. One is before and one is after t, right? So you take our tools are like that, and the world seemed to accept it when globalization came. So I think there's a lot of work we have to do in social science, and I'm very glad that I noticed more and more young people, at least in economics. This year's American Economic Association, Danny Roderick wrote about it. It was wonderful because there were more papers on behavior, there were more sessions on intersectionality than you would ever imagine in an American Economic Association conference. So that's encouraging that young economists are no longer willing to ask these questions. So they're smart kids. I'm talking about the top 20 schools. So they're writing job market papers as usual that are rubbish. But their real research agenda is something else. So what you're seeing now is young tenured economists asking questions about sociology and how it fits into the economic narrative, which I think is great. On your question, wow, that is a question on which, with respect to you, I know very little. So I'll tell you very quickly what I know, and I'll tell you where I depart. I think what you saw until the 70s was a very virtuous cycle. If you take W by R ratios, you saw W rising,
Let's say what W is, not
wages,
yeah.
and you saw R, the price of capital, rising, because productivity of both was rising, because total factor productivity was rising, because technology was rising, and because Fordism was coming to its, organized manufacturing was coming to a point where it was moving fairly smoothly in the developed countries. That enabled them to help set up, well, not all of them, many of them, a fairly good welfare state. And the mistake I think we made, it's easy to say this ex post, is we assumed that there was a sort of conjunction between that welfare state impulse that social democrats had, and I am one. We don't have a social democratic party in this country anymore, but I happen to be one. What can I do? That social democrats made was that this means democracy. I now think it didn't. What it meant, I think, was an oligarchy of elites that, through institutions, was intimately connected with the national project I spoke of having a better society. It was a nationalist impulse, having a better country. So in Sweden, for example, I would imagine that nationalism was conjectured with no Swede shall fall sick, and we are going to laugh at the Americans who do. So that was a social democratic impulse. And that brought about many of the forms of doing it were forms in which you had democratic engagement. And I'm making a larger point than India now, but I've certainly observed this in India. Other people will know better, Brexit and that sort of thing. I'll give you an example from India now. So my father was a member of the elite in the sense he was an economic journalist. He went abroad, he met people, but because of the time, his friends were Indian, and his connect with the countryside and with Indians through things like festivals. So on Diwali, my family did not sit and celebrate Diwali at home with expensive, we went and visited other people. That's what you did. And you visited people, you got to know people, and because the sociology was such, one, your neighborhood, but that is income binded, but also your community, whether you were a Bengali, whether you were of a particular caste, doesn't matter. There would be some social interaction. And the elites interacted fairly seamlessly across religion and caste. Now, it wasn't as if my father wouldn't have loved, perhaps. I'm sure he'd have loved to be your friend if you were his age then. He didn't have those opportunities to connect all the time. What happened with globalization, I think it happened in the developed countries also, it happened definitely in my country, is I like sushi. So thanks to globalization and social media and cheap foreign travel, I have friends who like sushi all over the world. We talk to each other every day, right? That process automatically means, because there are 24 hours in a day, that if you talk to people who are more like you, what is the word you young people use? Woke. So you're woke. Now, there aren't that many woke people in India. It's a nasty place. But you're meeting woke people every day on Facebook. You're meeting them on Twitter. You're meeting them. You're having conversations with them. It's cheap. Mobile phones are cheap. What is it called? WhatsApp is cheap. That then means that the effort you have to make to talk to somebody who is dramatically different from you goes down, and your understanding of them becomes less granular. This is my own lesson having come back to India after 24 years abroad. So I think that meant that, in a sense, the oligarchy, I think people had very few expectations in a social democracy, the oligarchy. All they expected was you had their back. They did not deny that your children would go to better schools, that you have better health care and a nicer life. They just wanted you to have their back. And I think in India, realization came after the good times of Vijay Mallya that the oligarchy no longer had your back. That vented itself in many ways, and these narratives will be different for every country, in anger at the oligarchy having let people down and the move to the least common denominator. So that's my rather unorthodox take. I think we misread the illusion between democracy and productivity growth quite fundamentally in the 70s. It was a benevolent oligarchy running a social democracy. And that circumstance has changed, and I think that is causing a lot of political pushback. Sorry about that, because I was part of them. So for the young people here, we let you down yet again. Finally, protest. This is easy and short. I'm going to be an uncle, as we call them here, people of my age. I'm going to sit back, relax, and let people who are much younger than me decide where to protest, how to protest, where to protest, when to protest. I'm not going to lecture you or even suggest anything to you. I want to follow you. If you ask me a question, I will answer it. I'll be a resource person for you. Because you have done what no generation in this country has done, at least since 1975. And I don't think that I have anything to tell you. You tell me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah. Yeah, that was a design provocation, but yeah.
Okay. Oops. Can you hear me? Okay. Is this? I can't tell if my voice is carrying.
Yeah. No. Maybe a little closer to the mic, a little louder.
Closer.
Yeah.
I don't want to eat this thing. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So this is going to be a little bit different from what we've just heard. Arumar and Ratan sketched an extremely broad and exciting canvas. Mine's is going to be less, I think, a little bit narrower than that. But let's see what it provokes in terms of a conversation. So what I want to talk about is urban space and the importance of urban space or urban geography. I am an urban geographer, and I think that space is fundamental to how we understand equality and inequality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about urban space. And I guess my starting point is that we're in a period now increasingly with urban inequality in which, as Abdulmalik Simone recently put it, quite often what's happening is a kind of rescuing of the social, an effort to rescue the social, an effort to simply maintain survival in the face of increasingly brutal and multifaceted inequalities, not just across the global south, but also increasingly in the global north. I think that those inequalities are profoundly spatial, and increasingly so. The spatial division, the spatial demarcation of inequality is increasingly prevalent and important for cities. And so I think then what we need to partly think about is ways of documenting, imagining spatial tactics, spatial imaginaries of urban equality. So I want to think about spatializing urban equality, and that's really all I'm going to say, and I'll try and be as brief as possible. Will you give me a warning if I'm blethering? And I'm beginning here with the great French Marxist historian. Other social theorists are available outside of Europe, but Henri Lefebvre remains nonetheless a useful voice in these debates. The Production of Space, a keystone book for many of us in geography who are interested in trying to think about, trying to read the city and trying to read inequality through the ways in which space is shaped and produced, and also, alternatively, other ways of imagining and performing urban space. So, lots of commentators have been talking about the ways in which social inequality are increasingly spatialized. We know these stories, we've heard a lot of them today. I'm not going to labor it very much. One of the central drivers of this, of course, is the real estate market. So Samuel Steen, in his recent book, Capital City, for example, talks about the kind of sheer worth and amount of money in the global real estate market. 60% of the world's assets, and the vast majority of that wealth, roughly 75%, is in housing. Andy Merrifield has written about this in relation to land and predatory capital. We know these stories about predatory real estate, speculative urbanism on land, on housing, on infrastructures, increasingly cleaving cities apart, increasingly fragmenting cities, so that fragmentation becomes a kind of urban development strategy. As Lefebvre himself argued, capitalism proceeds not in spite of spatial inequality, but because of it and through it, and increasingly so in cities right across the world. So we see this, for example, in the rush to high-density tower blocks across the world, from London and Manchester to Mumbai and Phnom Penh, often accompanied by the kind of construction of notions of scarcity of land, a need to use land for certain higher economic values, this constant kind of case being put of a particular and very narrow conception of value, which I think was partly what Adriana was getting at in her question, around market potential. And we see that in cities continually more and more often. This has been extremely well documented, of course. So I suppose the question that kind of follows in part from that is, the question for me is, what does urban spatial equality then look like? So we know, I think, what urban spatial inequality looks like. We're very good at documenting it. I come from a discipline, urban geography, that has become very adept at producing case after case of meticulously constructed depression about the ways in which cities are fragmenting spatially, and we're not so good for various reasons at thinking about equality. So I've put this slide up here, not knowing the answer to the question, and I think it's good strategy in any presentation to have at least one main question which you don't know the answer to. So I'll be interested to hear what other people have to say about that. But my starting point, I suppose, is that urban spatial equality at a minimum is about the spatial distribution of provisions, rights, and opportunities. At a minimum, it's about that kind of distribution. So it's not about everybody having the same thing, it's about some kind of spatial distribution of provisions, rights, and opportunities, which some people might call equity rather than equality. I think about this then as a verb rather than a noun, which is a kind of clunky way of saying that I think that urban spatial equality is something that has to be done, imagined, performed, called into being, claimed, fought for, contested over, and not something we can describe as a kind of destination where we all live in a certain kind of place with certain kinds of stabilities. For the simple reason that, as I'll come on to say, cities aren't stable and they're never complete. It operates urban spatial equality across different scales. We can think about universalist claims to urban spatial equality. We can think about claims to, for example, the right to water for everyone. And we can think about place-based action. And it's often relational. And we heard that, I think, from some of the papers in the last session, where many of the speakers talked about how when you're thinking about equality, you find yourself constantly cutting across multiple domains. So you're talking about labour, but you're also talking about the environment. You're also talking about the social world, the everyday experience of the city. You're also talking about policy. There's a kind of way in which equality necessarily kind of radically networks the city, makes us think about the interrelationship of multiple spaces and domains. So it's multiple, it's contingent in form. It can be a political claim, it can be an act of defence, it can be a form of provisioning or maintenance. And it has to be multiple, it has to be contingent. Urban spatial equality can only ever be those things because cities do not stand still. They change, and so too must the political struggles. None of us in the UK thought we were going to be going to protests about Brexit and the European Union for years at a time, but there it is. And who knows where the next 5 years will go in that crazy little island on the edge of Europe. So the point here is to kind of think about urban spatial equality as a makeshift spatial politics in which there is no single blueprint. So I want to very quickly flag up some ways of thinking about urban spatial equality, or what I'm calling here spatial tactics of urban spatial equality. These kind of verbs, if you like, spatial verbs, ways of practicing. 5 quick examples: spatial targeting, spatial augmenting, remaking spatial leftovers, tackling spatial stigma, and spatial provisioning. And I'm just going to end on a little note about the relationship between urban spatial equality and urban transformation. So firstly, spatial targeting, very quickly. This is an And what they were doing was they were taking uncollected buckets of human waste. You can see that in the middle picture there. They were not being collected by the municipality because of a labour dispute with the private company that was maintaining the toilets. And so what these activists did, and this is a kind of politics, I suppose, of the last resort, is take these buckets of waste and empty them at particular places in the city. The international airport, the steps of the state legislature in the middle, the main road leading from the airport into town, the N2 motorway. And this here was about taking something which has no business being in a place and putting it in that place. A very kind of spatially minded political strategy. This, I think, is a claim for urban equality, which is spatialized. Fundamentally, it is a form of targeting, which is a kind of politics of last resort, but about making a spectacular claim on the city. And it generates a debate at the scale of the city and beyond because of its shock value, of course. Spatial targeting. A second example, spatial augmenting. Many of you will be familiar with the group in Mumbai called URBS, which is a kind of architects of activist group who are involved in, for example, in various sites across the city, involved in kind of incrementally augmenting existing housing and infrastructure in informal neighbourhoods. And I've been very kind of inspired by some of their writing in terms of thinking about spatial equality, because for them, spatial equality is absolutely not about some kind of wholesale transformation. It isn't about the big, the bold, and the universalism that we often see in particularly some of the claims made by, for example, David Harvey about urban spatial equality, which I think are very, very important. I'm not being critical of Harvey, but it is about a kind of much more of a kind of acupuncturist kind of notion of urban spatial equality. And they're interested in, as they say, in a kind of tactical approach. Working to enhance and augment housing, supporting materials, improving neighbourhoods, helping to learn with how people use their neighbourhoods, how people build their neighbourhoods, and to support those processes in a long-term embedded kind of way. There's a million examples in India and beyond of this, of course, that people in this room know much more about than me. Spatial augmenting. Spatial leftovers. This comes from work I'm doing in Berlin with colleagues, and one of the things that's really struck me is the way in which a group of activists in Berlin, Zusammenkunft, which is a group of artists and cultural critics, are using old spaces in the city. And Berlin, of course, is a space with lots of leftover spaces, lots of empty spaces, which are quickly being snapped up by the kind of predatory speculative capital I talked about at the start, but which are still there, hanging around, waiting to be used. And so Zusammenkunft take old railway depots, they use abandoned buildings, they're using former government buildings from the GDR period, the Old East, and they're inhabiting them, temporarily or in longer term as refugee spaces, as cultural, artistic spaces, as low-income housing in a city which is becoming increasingly expensive. So this is a third form. A fourth form is around tackling spatial stigma. This is a fourth tactic of spatialising urban equality. And there is a massive tradition of urbanists, activists of different kinds, putting on exhibitions about cities, about neighbourhoods and cities that are stigmatised in the public discourse as a way of addressing the politics of recognition, which is surely a first step in any kind of politics of equality. Because how can you think about resources and delivery and provision to neighbourhoods which are constantly vilified in the public imagination? So there's plenty of examples of that. I won't go into this one in Kampala, which Schweib at the back knows a little bit about from a few years ago with some colleagues there. And finally, spatial provisioning, and this is the one I want to spend a bit more time on before I finish. And these are kind of more familiar forms, I think, of spatialising urban equality. These are forms of provisioning which operate at a municipal scale. And there's multiple examples, and I kind of put this kind of ad hoc list on the slide to cheer myself up on the plane. Because I was thinking it's so depressing reading about inequality all the time. That we could populate. It's important, but it's depressing. We could populate these lists. We've all got our own examples, but these are just a few that I was thinking of last night. A new rent control freeze in Berlin. So in Berlin, there's a rent control for 5 years because the city recognises that rents are getting out of hand and the city is transforming too quickly. Protests in Sao Paulo, which led to kilometres of new bus lanes. Estonia, the capital city, Tallinn, free public transport introduced a few years ago. San Fernando in the Philippines, a new sanitation tax which has led to massive investment in some informal neighbourhoods on sanitation. Strikes in Chicago which led to radical changes in funding for schools and homelessness. Successes of participatory budgeting which are mixed, and so on and so forth. We can go on and on and on with examples of this, and many of them are low key and many of them don't get promoted or recognised, but I think there's a plethora of forms here we can be documenting, pulling together, pointing to as kind of pathways to this kind of question of urban spatial equality. All of these forms of spatial provisioning, I think, interestingly, combine public and municipal pressure, so they don't originate with either the political parties or with social movements, but with some kind of combination thereof. They're all relational in their form. They all connect environment to labour, to society, to the economy in different kinds of ways. They're all spatially dynamic. They all operate in relation to a notion of the city as a space of transformation, and this is what I want to kind of end on. So I've been talking here about 5 forms of spatialising urban equality. There's lots of other ways we might think about this, but I think what's really vital is to recognise that many of these cases operate on a kind of makeshift basis, necessarily so, because of the nature of urban transformation. We've held it time and time again today, for example, that cities are marked and characterised increasingly so by displacement, by demolition, and by rebuilding. And you see this around us all the time in the cities that we work in, move to, visit, and so on. This kind of intensity of spatial transformation in many parts of the urban world, not everywhere, but in many parts. We see also new geographies accompanying that of density and expansion. So think, for example, of some of the work that Solly Angel and his colleagues in New York are doing, fantastic work, I think, documenting urban spatial transformation across the world. In the last, one of the fascinating things about their work is that it shows in a kind of quarter of a century, a 25-year period from 1990 to 2014, that cities doubled their area on average. So the footprint, the territorial footprint of cities doubled on average, and in many places it increased 10 times. That is a massive transformation, huge transformation. You see this huge growth of urban peripheries that we all know about, new towns developing on the edge of cities. This absolutely transforms the question of urban spatial equality. The geographies around us are changing, and so therefore must the struggle around the kinds of urban equalities that we're fighting for. So this kind of attention to transformation is why I think urban spatial equality must be makeshift, must be contingent, must be multiple, must be subject to transformation, just as the city and cities themselves transform. This map, for example, of densities high and low across Asia from a few years ago, if you'd taken this map 20 years ago, it would look completely different. And 20 years from now, it will look completely different. So whenever we're talking about urban spatial equality or urban equality, we need to think about it, I think, as part of the larger conversation, spatially in a context of transformation, and ask ourselves, what is this going to look like in a decade from now? Because we're quite often caught up in the struggles of the now, the next 6 months, the next year from now. But what about 10 years from now, when we might see quite massive transformations in some parts of the urban world, as well as all the other transformations around labour and technology that we've been hearing about? All of this changes, I think, the frontiers of urban spatial equality. So just one last example. This is from work, colleagues of mine, geographers, Catherine Brickell, has done some amazing work in Phnom Penh and Cambodia, which shows that the construction of the tower blocks in downtown Phnom Penh, which is happening on a huge scale, are predicated on the exploitation of rural peasants working in the brick kilns that create the bricks to build these massive buildings in patterns of debt bondage, slave labour in the city's brick kilns, working in noxious fumes. So she's connected very powerfully the metabolic to the kind of large-scale urban regional transformations and densifications of Phnom Penh. So what you start to see, in other words, is that when you look at spatial transformation, new kinds of questions emerge about how we think how we think about urban equality and how we spatialise it. Here, new connections between the body, between rural change, urban change, labour and environment. This isn't just about the city. This is also about the rural areas. It's also about migrant workers. It creates a different kind of question for how we think about urban equality. So, and all of this, I think, comes down a little bit to this question of the relation between different sectors, as I said a moment ago: environment, labour, the social, the urban. This is a great little book focused on the US, but I think a Green New Deal is partly where we need to go. I really believe that there's a lot of politics certainly in the UK and the US around a Green New Deal, which is really inspiring. I don't think any longer we can think about urban equality without also thinking about the climate emergency. And this is an argument that Kate Aronoff and others have made recently. The politics of climate change and the transformation of the built environment are the same damn thing. And that's exactly what Catherine Brickell has been arguing in her work in Phnom Penh about the brick kiln workers. And we could multiply those examples in relation to the transformations I've been talking about. You know, what the kind of transformations and densification I've been talking about are not simply changes to the built environment. They are massive ecological transformations on a huge scale. So finally, this is my last slide. The key issue here is not the fact of urban spatial transformation itself, but instead to ask, what are the terms upon which that transformation proceeds and with what consequences? So we need to be thinking, I think, about proliferating spatial tactics, such as those examples that I talked about of urban spatial equality, documenting them, telling their story, foregrounding them, learning from them. But I also think we need to be thinking about those groups, those actors, those powerful voices who are framing the debate about what urban space should look like now and should look like tomorrow. All those kind of smart city boosterists that seem to be kind of stubbornly persistent in their descriptions of the future city, and to fight instead for a different kind of view of urban space through some of the examples that I've been describing, but also many others that we can all, I think, bring to the table. So I think that's me. Yes, it is. So I'll leave it there. I don't know how long I've been speaking for, Aramar.
No, we're good.
Yeah?
Yeah,
So,
thanks
thank you.
Colin, I'm really glad that you've taken us from the large structural and institutional questions that Ratan and I tried to lay out to the tactics, because for both practitioners and for researchers, if you take, let's say, Solly Angel's framing, or the framing that we work on in terms of types of cities, if we try and bring that together along with the question of tactics, rapidly growing cities, one that are sort of redeveloping, older cities like Berlin that have many holes in it, and whatever it is. Yeah. If you're able to explore this within urban systems of how these tactics play themselves out, I think we might get a really interesting sense of how proposition may work itself out. Because I think we don't have an adequate vocabulary of this at the scale of the city. There was the stuff that happened in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s around upgrading and things like that, which created a vocabulary of a type. But I think building a vocabulary of this would give strength to the verb. The vocabulary would really enable and empower the verb in some senses. And the second thing which I found very interesting was the connect out to the regional, because we often talk about spatial inequality in either very limited terms, or we talk about it at a very macro scale. The connections in between and the linkages to the metabolism, to ecological processes, because in some senses livelihoods, especially in our environments in the global south, are often tied to ecological and production processes. So the connection between that, and in a sense planning has been very challenged to integrate them inside, would be very useful things to try and pick up and deal with. So transformation is happening, but how we can shape that, or how it can be shaped by the forces we're talking about in a different set of imaginary. And finally, I would say the imaginaries need to be challenged. The equal city is part of a rights discourse in some senses, but the materiality, the speciality of that is something that really needs to be put out, whether it's Vanessa's work in Africa or a whole range of others. The imaginaries are not challenged. And you're reproducing a whole range of other imaginaries which come from particular places, and in some senses planning hasn't sort of delved into that space. So having said that, open house, questions, responses to at the back and one here. So, yeah, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Colin. So this was a very, very compelling set of examples on spatial tactics, and I was just trying to connect it to Ratan's work, where he was actually talking about transnational capitalism, right? Strategies of transnational elites who are now aligning in very, very frightening ways. And so mine was really a question of scale, right? Because the kinds of spatial tactics that you were talking about, what would it take for it to actually accumulate into some kind of a transgressive politics of opposition, right? Just because the scale of capital accumulation that we're talking about is clearly global.
Glenn Keeker at DePaul University, and my question is going to be an invitation to hear your thoughts about how can we go from the analysis that you had at the end about the urban metabolism, developing on Lefebvre's notion in the production of space, a relationship between implosion and explosion. If we bring in the analysis of global labor chains and global commodity chains, and how this then is generating at this historical moment a global ecological crisis that's basically presenting us with an existential crisis. And that our solution to that reality are projects like disaster risk reduction, sustainable development goals, UN Habitat 3, and the Paris Climate Accords. And the way in which those aspirational goals are being realized is through smart city production. In other words, what I'm asking is, what's your analysis of digital production of space and the question of equity and equality in the digital production of space as the response to the crises, especially as that leads us to a world of artificial intelligence that's then going to fundamentally challenge the notion of agency and the problematic of a post-human world.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
Colin, one from me as well. Just thank you for that. I just wanted to push you on one thing. One of the big debates that are happening inside housing rights movements in India right now is a little bit of a self-reflection moment where we are asking, in a sense, an old question again, is whether we undermined ourselves by reducing demand for the right to land to the right to housing. And one of the things and the reason I'm asking is this, when you opened with the question of spatial equality, and that first sense of that minimum distribution of rights, opportunities, etc. And I'm wondering if some parts of the discussions on urban equality are partly that we have tamed ourselves too much. That in terms of the scale of the inequality, the demands for redistribution have returned and settled into a demands for minimum provision. Universal access to water at a minimum level, universal access to basic infrastructure, but our minimums are also becoming actually statistically and empirically our actual levels of access. And it's happening across a lot of that municipal public divide that you see, at least in Indian urbanism. So I'm wondering is it that, can we risk perceptions of equality that cede the aspirational and the fundamentally redistributive to the question of universal provision and minimal entitlement? And this is a question I'm asking myself as I'm asking to you, but this is a debate that's happening here, and I wanted to think about that because as compelling I find your examples, I'm also thinking that when I add them up together, I feel a little bit like it's almost holding back an uncivil punch. And I don't know what that looks like then in thinking about inequality, and I'm really wondering what we do with that.
So, yeah. These are great questions. Thank you very much. I'm not sure I've got very good answers. The question about transnational elites and the kind of question of scale, which I think relates a little bit as well to Gautam's question as well. There are, of course, examples, aren't there, of kind of movements that have become quite influential at a global scale, and have had some progress in kind of at least gaining attention, shifting debates. Someone this afternoon mentioned the Occupy movement. I was talking to someone this morning about Slum Dwellers International, and there are all sorts of views on Slum Dwellers International and their work, but a lot of what they've achieved has been really important. Global movements that pull together quite specific, sometimes, questions about housing or infrastructure, in the case of SDI, Slum Dwellers International, or larger questions about who owns the commons, how are rights distributed, how do we make decisions about the production of wealth and the management of wealth, in relation to Occupy, for instance. So I guess part of the story there is about surely some kind of alliance building, alignment between different groups. We see lots of examples of this, I think, at the moment around some of the Green New Deal thinking that I mentioned earlier. I think the book that Kate Aronoff and others have written does a good job of showing, for example, one of the cases I mentioned, Chicago, where the school teachers came together with other groups in the city, unions, homeless activists, to raise campaigns in the local media, to pressure the municipality to then shift its position in school pay and provisioning for homeless families into schools. There's also a similar story in Los Angeles. There's a kind of resonance between those two cities. So you start to see, groups talking to one another, building scale, making movements happen. There are lots of cases like this. It's slow, it happens in different ways. I guess one of the ways in which, I don't know if one of the books that I read recently, Ashley Dawson's book, Extreme Cities, which is, I don't know if you've read this book, but it's about the climate crisis. His kind of position is that, because you can't get the kind of global response to these transnational elites and their embedded power and their commitment to forms of carbon, we're going to have to wait for disaster to happen. This is a kind of classic kind of dystopian Marxist view of what's going to happen next. It's a very interesting analysis, but it leaves you feeling that it's only when the huge scale floods and fires happen that people start to shift their minds. Although the debate in Australia that's fallen out doesn't actually give you a huge amount of hope that even in that case that there would be a kind of, so that's not, I don't think waiting for the disaster is the trigger point. It's just about the slow work of kind of alliance building. I mentioned the Labour Party and the fact they lost the election, unfortunately, just before Christmas. And one of the debates about that has been that Labour failed to make the kind of relationships with the unions, the social movements, community activists across the country that would build something larger, would help push them over the edge in various constituencies across the country. Whether or not that is true, there's lots of examples in history where that does work. When you make those kind of alliance building cases, David Harvey has made that argument time and time again, for example. I think in relation to the question of, where were we? Global labour, commodities and labour and the ecological crisis. Where were we? So your question, I think, was about artificial intelligence in a smart city. I'm trying to think back now to the question. Yeah. Yeah.
Equality in an increasingly digitalized world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the there are lots of cases where digital technologies are being used, I think, in really productive ways to help augment social lives. To share. Someone mentioned Hong Kong. It was partly through the architecture of kind of clandestine social media, of relatively clandestine social medias, that the protesters in Hong Kong were able to become fluid and to move from one place to the other quickly and to anticipate police movements and so on. There's also lots of cases where when you have, for example, the kind of fires we've seen in Australia, where social media has been vital for communicating to people about where people are and trying to get people out of places and so on. I don't think the argument that digital media or AI is bad or good kind of holds up, right? This kind of notion that it's the smart city is this kind of self-surveillance Orwellian machine that, for example, doesn't quite hold up. I've got other criticisms of digital technologies and the kind of power that companies are investing in over cities in the production of those processes. I've got criticisms of around the faith placed in those technologies as technical fixes, but there are also lots of great examples of AI and digital technologies working for socially and economically progressive ends. And so I wouldn't take a kind of like an either-or kind of view of AI and its futures. The last question, got some about housing rights movements in India and about that kind of question. Listen, when I was doing this presentation, I absolutely felt what you just said, which is that you add it all up and you think, well, what exactly does this? Is this going? How transformatory is this? How kind of radical is this as a set of politics? I don't know. I just find the kind of decidedness I share your kind of concern, but I find the kind of decidedness about the question a little bit unsettling, because there is a sort of, surely a sense in which cities, when you some of these examples I talked about, they were very selective, the 5 cases I talked about, but they move sometimes in unpredictable ways, and they do form unpredictable alliances, they do shift debates. Politics has a way of surprising us, like time and time and time again. I really think the kind of question of surprise is not kind of like adequately, not given adequate status in our imaginations of politics and its futures. So as a result, there is a kind of continual dismissal of huge reams of political strategies because they're too incremental. They're not asking structural questions. That kind of dismissal that we've had so many times. I know that's not what you're saying, but I think there's I think we've got to be alert to that kind of sense of the potential openness and possibility that these kind of political strategies do enable that might surprise us. On the other hand, I guess, how do you build a kind of much more stronger discourse, a much more stronger kind of set of objectives that don't become managed and don't become minimalist in these ways is a really important question. So I'm not answering your question. I don't. There's a bunch of stuff on the tip of my tongue, but look, I'm just going to say that I flew all night last night. I didn't sleep, so at some point my brain's going to come. But yeah, I completely see what you're saying, right? And I would like us to continue that conversation. I don't have a very good answer right now. Sorry.
So, thanks so much. We can hand over to Karen now to bring everything together.
Okay, so Arama asked me to talk to the question of gender and intersectionality, and in a sense tied it to the way that the conference was structured from the start. So, in a way, I feel like I'm echoing a little bit some of Alan's comments about, I'm talking about things we've talked about for a long time. In this case, 30 to actually 50 years. Yeah. So I'm sorry if I don't sound like I'm saying something new, but I do believe I'm saying something significant. Okay.
Proposition at the end of
yes.
the day. Yeah.
So something so significant, actually maybe that's the point. It's so significant that it's been resisted by very powerful forces, which means that it's not insignificant at all. Yeah, and actually, I'm going to say things that may sound a little bit like platitudes, but they're not platitudes. They're super important, and they really matter to us. So I'm going to start by saying something that I've also said for a very long time. We are still using terms like people. We are still using terms like communities and households, and we refer to all and leave no one behind. And in other words, we're still using terms that imply an inclusion of everybody, and yet our actions are actually a lie to that in every single way. And so it seems to me that we need to just remind ourselves about some of the ideas that relate to this notion of gender and intersectionality, because they're at the heart of these inequalities. I think what's interesting is that intersectionality became super important because of the way that gender organized, the feminist movement organized, and in a way that many people, many women, felt left out. And so some of the first discussions about intersectionality emerged out of the race and gender discussions in the United States. But we can see that echoed in many places in Latin America around how poor women felt left out of many gender-based gender equality discussions, and many other examples around the world. And I was also reminded when I thought about it, and was reading randomly the other day, and was reminded that it's the 25th anniversary of the UN Beijing Platform for Action on Gender Equality, and actually that particular event in itself reflected such intersectional tensions that in a way we should have been warned for what was coming. Yeah? And so we're talking here about the intersectional relations, of course, not of gender, class, age, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, ability, and really the very difficult recognition of the simultaneity of that, it's even difficult to say, of that in every one of us. Yeah? And so it seems also that we need to repeat the things we know very well, that the way in which the form of that intersectionality is deeply contextual. It can't be generalized across context. Yeah? It's very specific, and I think what has been amazing about today has been the revealing of how that's worked in very contextual places. And yet there are common themes. Yet there are common themes across all those specificities. And of course, the other thing which slips off our tongue these days, but I don't know how, it's still not easily, somehow we haven't put the pieces together. We constantly talk about the social construction of intersectional identities. And we know that intellectually, the social reproduction process and how transmission of resources and social identities are historically passed from one generation to the next. And yet we still sit with complicated positions around what is considered as natural and God-given issues linked to identities which actually are in tension with this notion of social construction. And so we actually then, it appears that we do have issues with the simultaneity of identities and the intersecting sources of oppression, which we don't always seem to well understand and to recognize and to make visible, and even less to practice in, for example, the process of urban planning and urban development in cities. So having said that, and I feel like I'm repeating myself, but maybe worth repeating that, I just want to, in a sense, to put forward three simple propositions, messages, things that I think we should be thinking about very seriously in the rest of our time together. The first is, again, I say not a platitude, because it really, I think, is very significant. Intersectional identities matter in the experience of urban life. They really matter, okay? And they matter as a result of different and often unequal access to and control over resources inside and outside the household. And we've talked about that in many amazing ways today. And two of those key resources relate to questions of wealth, deeply connected to questions of wealth. Money and land, you know, in which these inequalities are deeply, deeply embedded, and which gender is a very important factor, but also intersects with other social relations. But gender holds so much there because of marriage, divorce, inheritance, all these critical dimensions of our lives that actually reproduce these kind of inequalities. But they're also reflected, as our colleagues have shown, in the different and often unequal access to and production of services, the provision of services, the goods of collective consumption, like housing, transport, water, and sanitation. And today I was really gratified also to listen to colleagues presenting on what I think is a super important dimension of talking about rethinking the equal city, which is the different use and often threatening and controlled experience of public space in cities. And therefore, the limiting of not just spatial, but also socio and political mobility in the city, where gender is obviously important, but intersects very fundamentally with a lot of other identities, of which some were mentioned in the papers today. This results, obviously, in a deeply unequal distribution, material distribution, which is the basis for any decent life. And I think that what's important, and I think our colleagues have all, again, raised this today in many different ways, it's not just the practices, our urban practices, that reflect this, but we also need to get to grips with the deep distribution, the structural drivers behind these changing realities. And I think that what was wonderful today was to see the variety of methodologies that people are using in order to show these deeply unequal distributional issues in the city. And often innovative methodologies, very reflective ways of thinking about generating knowledge on this. But in most contexts, it seems, to go to my second point, that urban communities and policymakers and planners at all levels seem to have a problem with the reciprocally recognizing identities. Actually, let alone intersectional identities, okay, which is deeply embedded in the political economy, in the culture, and the history, some of which came through already in our panel discussion today. in the words of my colleague Vanessa Castanbrotto and her colleague Susana Neves Alves, she talks about the recognition means acknowledging the existence and validity of many forms of living in urban areas. And how do we do that? How do we do that? We need to be clear that this isn't a simple process, because within different identity frames, there are a huge number of competing narratives about those frames, those identity frames, okay? The ideologies, for example, that relate to positions on gender are certainly not the same for everybody, just as they're not the same around religion or ethnicity. And this is the basis of many of our political tensions and things that are happening to us right now as we speak, as we discussed earlier. So contested interpretations of identity practices within groups in civil society and the state really matter, and language matters around that. And I think what we also need to be clear about in recognition, questions of recognition, is that one of the most powerful ways of manipulating questions of recognition is the use of making things invisible. And this manipulation of invisibility has been done so skillfully, sometimes in the name of professional practices, sometimes in the name of the true identity, what people see as the true identity of the particular issue that they're talking about. Just at a very simple level, for example, for many years, we used to collect data on the basis of interviews with the head of household. This was the way we did it. Yeah? It hasn't been that long that we had to deconstruct who was the head of household and who was giving information about the household and about other people in a way that really influences the outcome of the work we do. I can give many examples around how we count, what we count, which is important in making things visible and the process of recognition. And this applies also to our language. And I think one of the most powerful messages for me today that came through in our discussions was actually the recognition of the porousness of the public and private spheres. We often, in our professional practice, put, well, the private sphere, that's over there. We're dealing with the public sphere. Okay? But no, our whole discussion today has been shown how, when you take, for example, a gender position, you bring to the forefront this relationship between the private and the public sphere, and how much they affect each other and how much they matter. And I think any emancipatory agenda has to take that into account, and any professional practice has to take that into account. It's not a new idea, right? It's not a new idea, but it seems that we forget it every now and again when it suits us. Yeah? And actually bringing it to the fore, as people did today, was so amazing, really so amazing, that we can talk about livelihoods and employment at the same time as we talk about childcare and breastfeeding, okay? Because they matter together, yeah? They matter together. I think also what we've seen in the history of our practice, and somebody alluded to that today, is also around recognition. We've tried to fashion institutions to help us reflect recognition, but we haven't done it too well. So we saw, for example, around the question of gender, a whole set of new institutions that developed in the state. You know, ministries of women's affairs or bureaus of women's affairs. It took different forms in different places. And really, we've seen almost 30 to 50 years of discussion about the issues related to human resources, to budgeting, to new methodological implications of that kind of institutional change. And yet, we have to ask ourselves, and by the way, we're super proud of the term mainstream, because mainstreaming reflected something else, yeah, something else. And yet, when did mainstreaming become a silo? Yeah? Because that's what happened to it. And so I think institutionally, and the link to recognition, we need to really wake up and understand better what, and it's difficult, it's not easy to create this. The challenge of intersectional mainstreaming institutionally is huge. This is why I tend to talk not about recognition, but about reciprocal recognition. Because it's not just about addressing identity blindness of communities and policymakers, but it's also about people of different identities making their own identity claims. It's not something that's going to happen by just waiting for people to recognize the truth of intersectional identities. Okay? So, in other words, those claims, I think, what traditionally have been fostered through processes of consciousness raising about inequalities, and then for people to recognize that these situations are deeply unfair and become the grit in the process of mobilization and collectivization of ideas. So that takes me very neatly to my third proposition, which is deeply political, because the process of actually raising consciousness and people making claims on the basis of identity is deeply political. And so the third issue for me is, does political participation through different forms of governance, does it hold some critical potential for addressing intersectionality? Somebody referred today to the full exercise of citizenship. I think that was in Swapnil's paper. And I think it's a wonderful term, but what does it mean? Yeah, what does it mean? You talk about the constitutional settlement. New constitutional settlements rest on a political buy-in and a participation by people. And so, in the end, we're talking about the political process of defending the gains we've made, because we have made some gains, but also extending those gains into new areas. And then, of course, though, we have to ask ourselves a question that's already been raised, which is, how are alliances for emancipation built across identities? Because that, for me, is the hope for future change. Yeah? So how does that happen? At the same time, I would say, Gotham is developing the tactics of protest. At the same time, not either or not one before the other. At the same time as developing tactics of protest and the transgressive politics of opposition. Yeah? These are deeply interrelated processes. And I think trying to politically and tactically understand the conditions for which the possibility to build alliances across difference is super, I think, challenging. And traditionally, this has come face to face with very many complex questions about the issue of representation, of what does political representation mean in the context of intersectional identities? How do you build that? And, I mean, who is representative of different identities and how? And we've seen all sorts of institutional ways of doing that. For example, using quotas and using different techniques politically to try to make this thing work. We've also seen the elite capture of many of these processes. So the distortion of them and really the reinforcement of reproduction. It seems to me that, and I can say more about, I think that what's important in this process is, of course, the whole issue of the knowledge that we produce that drives our our different political positions, and what knowledge is valued, assumed to have value in this process, which links back to the wide discussion we had today about knowledge co-production, which I think is a critical discussion, which I know we'll continue through the days together. But there is one quotation that I read a long time ago that really, in a way, challenged me, and in a sense put together this idea of political participation across identities in a way that made me think perhaps a little bit differently. Wallace and Moore Milroy, in the context of Canadian politics, attempts to kind of traverse a wide diversity of Canadian politics, argued for a political and governance system that takes intersectionality and difference as a point of departure, to quote them, for people to come to the planning process as themselves, rather than as a generic person or only as a representative of a particular human rights defined social group. Seems to me that's something to think about and to unpack a little bit. So, drawing this together, I think we do need at least 3 questions on our agenda through the 3 days. How do intersectional identities of citizens impact their experience of urban life? And I think we're unpacking that more and more. How are intersectional identities of citizens reciprocally recognized in community discourses and in policy and planning discourses? And final political question is, how are intersectional voices actively engaged in political decision making? And of course in the knowledge generated that on which many of these decisions and discussions are based. To end, Anne Phillips, the UK political scientist, exhorted, and I think she's right to ask this question or to make this proposition. It has to be possible, she said, to be both different and equal. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great way to end today. So, responses, questions? Yes. No. I mean, it's been an 15-minute day. So that's like, we should actually, go for a standing ovation for the four of us who've been in the room for this long.
Not sure of anyone.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Take it to bed with us. Yeah. I mean, it's been a great day. We opened with breastfeeding as a really great way of getting into this thing, and to close with this question that you had just now of difference and equity is a great way of closing. So thank you all. I think it's been a really wonderful day today, and hopefully we will rest on some of this, get some sleep, and come back tomorrow morning at 9:30. Half an hour grace. So thank you very much. Goodbye.